Your position in 1980 was that humankind had already overshot the planet's permanent carrying capacity and that a crash was inevitable. If that was true then, our situation is clearly much more serious today. How confident are you that we can achieve ecological enlightenment and manage this crash in a humane fashion?
We are beginning to achieve ecological enlightenment, not as rapidly as I would wish, and we didn't start as soon as I would now wish. We will make some adaptations that will be helpful. But because we have started so much too late, having already overshot carrying capacity and continuing the overshoot process right now, we will not escape catastrophe. I do not expect Homo sapiens to become extinct in the near future. Briefly, I did worry about that for a while, but I think the one way in which our superabundance will serve us in the long run is that there will be a remnant of the present population even after the catastrophe happens. But that's what we're going to have to face, is that it will only be a remnant. 6.7 billion of us are so far in excess of the carrying capacity of this planet for our ways of life, even for our early ways of life, that the remnant will be much, much smaller than that. I've begun to describe the 21st century as the bottleneck century. Ecologists speak of bottlenecks as situations in which a superabundant species has to diminish in number, and only a remnant population gets through the bottleneck. And that's what's going to happen to us, I think, in this century.
One of your themes is that, quote, our common plight is not really due to villains, unquote. What do you mean by this?
It's too easy to blame somebody for our troubles, some individual or some small group of individuals. But if our troubles are really due to the fact that industrialization led us in the direction of reliance on non-renewable resources to a great extent and enabled us to multiply way beyond carrying capacity, we all participated in the process. The inventors of the devices that enabled us to do this were good people. They weren't villains. James Watt, who invented the steam engine and began the process, really, of our excessive reliance on the prehistoric photosynthesis that occurred during the Carboniferous period that laid down this supply of combustible materials. He was a good man, and it would do no good now to say, oh, that bad man should not have done that. He wasn't a bad man. Sure, there are villains, but the villains are not the major source of our difficulties today. And the tendency to look for a villain and then to seek vengeance and to confuse vengeance with justice and to confuse even justice with solution to our problem is a part of the problem.
You refer to a new ecological paradigm and a truly ecological perspective. Could you describe this paradigm and perspective?
To think of Homo sapiens as a member of the animal kingdom, albeit with some abilities that no other members of the animal kingdom have, to recognize that like all other animal species, we require resources that we take from the environment in which we live, that we require an environment in which we can do our various kinds of activities, and that we require an environment into which we can put the discards of our activities, not only the metabolic products of our own life processes, but even the whole corpus when we're through with it. we have to recognize that an environment serves us in three ways. It's a source of supply, it's activity space, and it's a depository for end products. SAD, source, activity, depository. Make an acronym out of that. SAD. It's a sad fact of life that we have to face up to. And I think ecologists are more inclined to face up to that, to recognize it, than people who don't happen to be ecologists.
You deride a common attitude that you call cargoism. Could you explain what this is and why you oppose it?
In the Melanesian region of the Western Pacific, when the Europeans began invading that area, the native population, the Melanesians, were impressed with the equipment that European and American people had, particularly in World War II. This is when it really became strong, when ships brought all kinds of stuff to the islands that these people marveled at, and airplanes brought stuff. They developed what were called cargo cults. They could see this cargo coming in, and the Europeans had it and they didn't have it, and they developed a mythology that suggested that some of their brethren elsewhere in the world might have been producing this stuff, and it was rightfully theirs if only they could get the right belief system and so on, and take possession of it. And they even started building wharfs and runways for the expected transport that was going to bring the cargo to them. Well, by using that as a metaphor, I've argued that modern people expect cargo to come, the products of industry just to keep coming and so on. And cargoism is my term for the expectation that this stuff will keep coming even when we have already overshot carrying capacity. And I'm arguing that we're really not a whole lot better off with our modern version of that superstition than the Melanesians were with their version of it.
Dr. Catton, you feel that exuberance and optimism are dangerous and that we should expect the worst. Why do you think this is the correct attitude?
Because the worst is going to come. And if we don't expect it, it'll hit us harder than if we are expecting it. Let me think about a better way of putting that.
Sure.
One of my first jobs after graduate school was in an agency where the boss had a mother who was terminally ill. And she had embraced a religious point of view at that time that suggested that her illness must be due to her lack of faith. That if she'd had the right faith, she would have overcome this illness and so on. He was saddened by the fact that that led her to have guilt feelings about her illness. The illness was bad enough in itself, but the guilt feelings made life worse. The last few months of her life were spoiled for her by the fact that she felt guilty about being sick. I think our civilization is somewhat in that kind of dilemma, that we tend to think that somehow we are bad people because of the things that we're doing to this planet, rather than that innocently we just happen to find that stuff that we got out of the ground that was combustible as fuel and burned it and spoiled the atmosphere. We ought to recognize that there have been other species that have fouled their own nests and did it innocently, but they had to face the consequences eventually. But at least they didn't have to get sad about how bad we were for fouling our nest and so on.